The cold came through the stone floor first, not through the walls, not through the high, narrow window, but through the floor itself, rising into the soles of her feet, like something that had been waiting there all winter for the right moment to climb. Sorcha had been standing in the antechamber for 40 minutes. She knew, because she had counted the torches along the far corridor, 9 of them, each burning at intervals she could time by watching the smoke curl, and each cycle of the nearest flame took roughly 4.5 minutes. She had nothing else to count. They had taken her satchel at the gate. They had taken the small folding ledger she carried in her coat. They had left her boots, which was charitable, and her silence, which was a mistake. She was good with silence. She had always been good with silence. What she thought about, standing there on the cold stone in the antechamber of the Greyvale Pack's great hall, was not fear, it was arithmetic. She counted 7 council members who had already filed past her without acknowledgement. She counted the weight of the charge against her: unlicensed healing, trespass into council-designated territory, practicing Omega medicine on a ranked warrior without disclosure of status, and she converted each charge into its likely penalty, and she found none of them fatal, and she breathed. The antechamber smelled of pine ash, tallow, and something deeper beneath both, old blood scrubbed down to a mineral trace in the mortar, the kind of smell that meant the room had seen judgments before, the kind of smell that meant some of them had not ended in fines. She had been brought here as a tribute. That was the formal word the border marshal had used. Tribute, transferred. In settlement of the debt her home village owed the Greyvale Alpha after the water rights dispute of the previous autumn. She was not a warrior. She was not a ranked beta or a council appointee or anything the great packs generally wanted as tribute. She was an Omega healer with no formal certification, a reputation that stretched 40 miles in every direction through the hill settlements, and hands that knew things her papers did not record. The border marshal had seemed embarrassed by her. He had written Omega, unranked, occupation unclear on the intake form, and handed her to a junior steward, who clearly had no idea what to do with her, and so had placed her in the antechamber and gone to ask someone. That had been 40 minutes ago. 8 cycles of the nearest torch. The doors opened. The room beyond was longer than she had expected. 22 meters, she judged by the pillars, 6 of them, spaced at roughly equal intervals. The ceiling vaulted high, and the council table ran the length of the central space. 7 members seated on one side, 1 chair at the head, at the far end, occupied. She did not look at that chair yet. She walked forward because no one told her to stop, and because forward was the only direction in a room shaped like this one, and because she had made a private promise to herself in the antechamber, not to be pulled, not to be hauled, not to be moved by anyone else's hand tonight. She would move under her own authority, even here, especially here. The council member nearest the door had pale eyes and a ledger open in front of him. He looked at her the way a merchant looks at goods that arrive damaged. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than he expected, and she saw his eyes shift first. Small thing, important thing. The chair at the far end of the table was made from dark wood and iron, and the man who occupied it was built along the same lines, wide at the shoulder, still, and occupying the chair with a quality of mass that made the chair look small. His hair was dark, cropped close at the sides, and he had a stillness to him that was not peace. It was the stillness of something that had already decided. He had not looked up when she entered. He was reading, or performing reading. Either way, he had not looked up, and that told her something about how this was going to be arranged. She was meant to wait for his attention. She was meant to experience the wait as diminishment. He would look up when he was ready, and the looking up would itself be a judgment, a calibration of her standing against his own. His name was Darius. She knew that much from the border marshal's briefing, delivered in a whisper, as if the name itself required a lower register, Alpha Darius Kale, head of the Greyvale Pack, 12 packs unified under his governance in the Northern Territories. 34 years old, no Omega consort. Known for decisions that were final, for sentences that were carried out the same hour they were passed, and for a council that operated with his authority and exceeded it without consequence, because no one had yet shown them a consequence. She stopped 10 feet from the table. She clasped her hands in front of her because it was practical. It kept them warm. He thought she was nothing. The council thought the same. Not one of them knew that the woman standing on that cold stone floor had already read every judgment this council had passed in the last 8 months, had already mapped their errors, and had already decided what she intended to do about it. The pale-eyed council member, she put his name as Hadrick from the border marshal's list, set down his pen and folded his hands. He had a way of folding his hands that was meant to communicate authority, and instead communicated that he had practiced it. "You are the Omega from Kale's Crossing," he said. It was not a question. "I am from Kale's Crossing," Sorcha said. The correction was quiet, barely a shift in the sentence. 3 of the council members heard it. She saw 2 of them register it. One of them, a woman at the far left with iron-gray hair, looked up from her own papers for the first time. Hadrick's folded hands tightened. "The charge of unlicensed healing pertains to your treatment of a ranked Greyvale warrior within the contested boundary. You did not disclose your Omega status. You did not seek council approval. You administered a course of treatment that continued for 11 days. 19 days, Sorcha said. The warrior's record in your hall's own ledger will show 11. The actual course of treatment was 19 because the standard 11-day protocol for that particular lung injury is insufficient. I extended it. He recovered fully. He returned to active duty in 22 days, which is 8 days ahead of the Greyvale standard recovery curve." End quote. The room was quiet, not the quiet of attention, the quiet of surprise, encountering a surface it hadn't expected. Hadrick said nothing for a moment. "You are speaking of pack medical records you should not have access to. I spoke with the Warriors unit commander, who spoke with me freely, because I had just successfully treated his wounded subordinate. People talk when they're grateful. I listened." The woman with the iron-gray hair made a small sound, not quite a laugh, something drier than that. Sorcha did not look at her yet. She kept her eyes on Hadrick, because Hadrick was the active threat, and you watched the active threat. The Alpha at the far end still had not looked up. Darius sat with one hand resting on the table and the other holding the document he was reading, and Sorcha had noted within 30 seconds of entering that the document was upside down. She did not know what to make of that yet. She filed it. Hadrick gathered himself. He had the kind of face that was used to reasserting itself after being caught off guard. The charge carries a penalty of forfeiture and binding to pack service. You are already transferred as tribute. The question before this council is the nature of your service assignment. He glanced down the table. 2 of the other members nodded. It was the kind of nod that meant the outcome had been discussed before she entered. It usually was, in rooms like this. She had expected it. "I am a healer," Sorcha said. "That is not a question of status. It is a question of what I know how to do. You are an Omega without rank or certification. The warrior I treated is alive and functional. He might not be either of those things if I had waited for a certified practitioner to cross 60 miles of winter road." One of the council members at the far right, a broad man with a grey beard, shifted in his chair. His name from the list was Barrow. He had a scar along his left jaw that pulled when he frowned, and he was frowning now, but not at her. He was frowning at Hadrick. That was notable. She filed that too. Hadrick straightened. "The nature of your service assignment will be, before you finish that sentence," Darius said. His voice was low, and it moved through the floor the same way the cold had. Not loud. It simply arrived, flat and heavy, the way stone arrives when it falls. I want to know who gave the warrior's unit commander permission to discuss pack medical records with an unlicensed outsider. The room changed. Sorcha felt it, the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, a tightening, a holding. Hadrick turned toward the far end of the table. Alpha. It is a simple question, Hadrick. The warrior was pack property under your care protocol. His unit commander discussed his case with a stranger, without authorization. That is a breach. I want to know who sanctioned it. He was not looking at Sorcha. He was looking at Hadrick, and the look was the kind that compresses a man. Hadrick's folded hands came apart. He had not expected this angle. Neither had Sorcha. She had expected the council to be the mechanism of judgment, and the alpha to be its endorsement. What she was seeing instead was something else. She was seeing a man who had been watching his own counsel with something close to what she had been feeling for the past 40 minutes in the antechamber, something like measuring. Darius finally turned and looked at her. His eyes were dark gray, the color of lake water in November, and they did not move around her face the way most eyes did. They settled, stayed, as if he were reading something he already knew the approximate content of, and was checking the details. She looked back. She did not look away. She had made that promise to herself, and she was going to keep it all the way to the end, however the end arrived. The iron-gray woman spoke. Her name was Vaya. The warrior spoke of you by name, Vaya said, and the information arrived in the room like something placed carefully on a table, not thrown, placed. He told 3 separate people that an Omega healer from Kale's Crossing had saved his breathing. He was specific about the treatment. He was specific about the person. Good, Sorcha said. Then you have more than my word. Darius said nothing else that evening. He let Hadrick conclude the formal portion of the session, which took 9 minutes and produced an outcome that was technically a penalty, mandatory service to the hall, term unspecified, but which contained no forfeiture and no binding oath, and which Sorcha recognized as a different sentence than the one Hadrick had originally been prepared to deliver. The junior steward who had parked her in the antechamber appeared again and led her out through a side corridor. His name, she had managed to extract in the original weight, was Pell. He was roughly 20 years old, thin in the way of someone who ate irregularly, and he navigated the corridor with the particular confidence of a person who had memorized the building rather than understood it. He knew where the doors were, but he did not know what the rooms were for. She was given quarters on the 4th floor of the Eastern Hall. The room was roughly 5 meters by 4, with a window that looked north and a fireplace that worked. There was a bed, a table, a chair, and a chest for belongings. There was a hook on the back of the door for her coat. The bed had 2 blankets, both heavy, both wool, both gray. The fire had been laid but not lit. She lit it herself, using the materials on the hearth, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since the border marshal had collected her from Kale's Crossing 6 days ago, she allowed herself to be still, without counting anything. Her hands began to tremble. She had known they would. It was always like that. The body waited until the moment of safety, and then reported everything it had held back. Her hands shook for about 90 seconds, and she breathed through it, and then they stopped. She pulled off her boots and set them by the fire. The soles were still cold. She thought about Darius and the upside-down document. She thought about Hadrick's folded hands coming apart. She thought about Vaya's voice, dry and careful. She thought about Barrow's frown, directed not at her, but sideways. There were fault lines in that council. That was not what she had expected. What she had expected was a wall, seamless and institutional. What she had found was a wall with 3 visible cracks. She thought about the Alpha's voice moving through the floor. She thought about his eyes settling on her face and staying there. She had been looked at in that council chamber as if she were a problem, an inconvenience, a commodity, and a question. Only one of those categories had made her careful. Outside the window, the northern dark was complete. No stars, cloud cover low, and a wind beginning that she could feel even through the glass. Tomorrow she would be assigned some form of work. She did not know what. She suspected Hadrick would make it something punitive if he had the authority to specify it. She suspected Via might balance that if she had the inclination. She suspected Darius had already decided and had not told either of them. She lay back on the bed without changing, because her spare clothes were in her satchel, and her satchel was still wherever the gate guard had put it. Her coat was on the hook. The fire was burning now, small and steady, doing what it was made for. She was in a pack hall that owed her village a water rights arrangement, not a debt. She was in a room she had been given as a result of a judgment session that had not gone the way the judging parties planned. She was still, if she was being precise about it, in a great deal of danger. The council could reconvene. Hadrick had not finished. The Alpha had redirected tonight's proceeding, but redirection was not resolution, and a powerful man who redirected without deciding was simply a powerful man who was biding his time. She fell asleep faster than she meant to. The fire burned down slowly over the next 4 hours, and the room went from warm to merely cool, and the wind outside moved along the eastern wall of the hall and found no way in. She had made no promises to herself beyond the one about moving under her own power, and she had kept that one, and it was enough for tonight. In the morning there was a knock at her door, at what she estimated was 6th hour. Pell, again, with a tray that held a bowl of something grain-based and steaming, a cup of dark tea, and her satchel. She looked at the satchel. Alpha's instruction, Pell said, in the tone of someone reporting a weather event, to return it. She took the tray and the satchel both, and she thanked him, and she waited until he was gone, before she opened the satchel to check the contents. Everything was there. The folding ledger, the case of dried herbs sorted by condition, the bone-handled toolkit in its worn leather wrap, the 7 pages of notes she had compiled on the Greyvale Pack Council's judgment record, annotated in her own small hand. She looked at those 7 pages for a long moment, then put them back. He had returned the satchel without opening it, or he had opened it, read what was there, and returned it anyway. She ate the grain bowl. It was better than the food she'd been given at the border station, seasoned properly, and it arrived hot, which meant someone had timed the delivery. That was either competence or intention, and she did not yet know which. She dressed. She packed the satchel. She put on her coat. She opened the door and found the corridor empty and went to find out what happened next. What happened next was the healer's annex. It occupied the ground floor of the northern building, accessible through a covered walkway that accumulated wind on 3 sides and delivered it at full force to anyone walking through it. Sorcha discovered this at roughly 6th hour and 20 minutes, arriving with her hair rearranged by the wind and her coat inadequate for the task, and she stepped into the annex and stopped. The smell hit her first: linseed oil, dried sage, the undersmell of old poultice, and something sharper beneath it that she identified after a moment as copper sulfate. Someone had been attempting to treat a joint condition with an old method mineral soak, not incorrectly, but incompletely. She stepped further inside. The annex was a long room with rough plastered walls and a row of cot frames along the left side, currently unoccupied, and a work table along the right, with a disorganized arrangement of supplies that she spent exactly 3 minutes studying before she began to reorganize. Nobody had told her to. Nobody had specifically told her not to. She had been assigned to hall service without specification. The annex had no assigned healer. She knew this because she had asked Pell that morning, and Pell had said the last healer left 8 months ago, which coincided with the period covered by the judgment records she had been reading, which was a coincidence she found interesting. A woman appeared in the doorway at the far end of the room, 20 minutes into Sorcha's reorganization. She was perhaps 60 years old, short, built like a fence post, with white hair cut to the jaw, and the flat eyes of someone who had heard most things people said, and found few of them original. She watched Sorcha move 3 jars of mineral compound to the correct shelf without introducing herself. "You're not what I expected," the woman said finally. "What did you expect?" "Hadrick described you as an unlicensed vagabond healer from a hill settlement." "That's accurate." He made it sound like a criticism. Sorcha set down the jar she was holding. "I'm Sorcha." "Merit," the woman said. "I keep the hall accounts." She said it the way you'd say I know where you buried things. Sorcha looked at her. Merit crossed the room and picked up one of the jars Sorcha had not yet moved and put it on the shelf Sorcha had already designated for its type, correctly, without being shown the system. "The previous healer," Sorcha said. Merit shook her head. "Left in the autumn." There was a disagreement. With the council. With Hadrick. The Alpha had nothing to do with it, which was itself the problem. Sorcha turned that over. A council member with the authority to drive out a hall healer, and an Alpha who either didn't notice or didn't interfere. 2 possible explanations. She preferred neither of them. She preferred evidence. "What's the worst ongoing condition in the hall right now?" Sorcha asked. Merit looked at her steadily for a moment. Then she said, "The cook's boy, 7 years old, winter chest, 3rd recurrence this season." Hadrick authorized 1 consult from a traveling certified healer in the first episode. That healer prescribed rest and honey root tea, sent a bill for 40 silver. The boy improved briefly and relapsed twice since. "Where is he?" "Kitchen quarters. His mother is Pella." "She won't ask for help from the hall again, not after the fee." Sorcha picked up her satchel. "Then I'll go to her." Merit stood aside. She did not offer to accompany Sorcha, and she did not tell her where the kitchen quarters were. She simply stood aside. Sorcha went to the doorway, stopped. "Marit, yes. The copper sulfate, soak in the far basin. Someone is using it for joint stiffness." "Barrow," Marit said, "has been for 6 weeks. It will help the inflammation, but it's drying the tissue too aggressively. I'll leave a modified compound on the shelf." He should alternate it with the linseed yarrow preparation, 3 days on, 2 days off. The ratio matters. I'll write it down. Merit studied her for another moment. "All right," she said. It was not a compliment. It was something more useful. It was the sound of a door that had been locked, deciding it might open after all. The kitchen quarters were 2 corridors and 1 flight of stairs below the annex, warmer than anywhere else in the hall, because of the ovens that ran along the eastern kitchen wall, and Sorcha found Pella by following the smell of bread and the sound of a child's cough. Pella was perhaps 30 years old, dark-haired, with the hands of someone who worked with heat and had learned not to protect herself from it. She looked at Sorcha, standing in her doorway, and her face went through 3 states in about 2 seconds. Suspicion, then something that was almost hope, that immediately clamped back down into suspicion again, because hope had cost her 40 silver once already, and she was not going to let it be cheap. "I'm not from the council," Sorcha said. "I'm the new hall healer. I'm not going to send you a bill. I'm going to look at your boy, and if I can help him, I will. And if I can't, I'll tell you plainly." Pella looked at her for 4 more seconds. Then she opened the door. The boy's name was Fen. He was, as Merit had said, 7 years old, and he was lying on a narrow bed in the inner room of the kitchen quarters, with the shallow, effortful breathing of someone whose lungs had been fighting on reduced capacity for too long. His color was poor, not dangerous poor yet, but the kind of pale that deepened overnight and required watching. He had dark circles under his eyes that were older than this episode. He had been fighting this since before autumn. Sorcha sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Hello, Fen." He looked at her with the watchful, unenchanted eyes of a child who had seen enough healers to know they were just people with bags. "Hello," he said. "Does it hurt to breathe, or does it just feel tight?" "Tight," he said. like something sitting on it. How long has it felt like that today? Since yesterday morning. Sorcha opened her satchel. Pella stood in the doorway with her arms folded, watching. Sorcha made her examination methodically, the way she had learned it, which was by doing it 7,000 times, in hill settlements, where there was no other option. She pressed 2 fingers to the sides of his throat. She listened to his chest with the small bone cone instrument she carried that amplified breath sounds, pressing it to 4 points on his back, 2 on each side, working from the base up. She noted the quality of sound at each point. She noted the discrepancy between left and right. She noted the way his shoulders rode up slightly when he inhaled, compensating. She asked him 4 more questions, and he answered all of them with the economy of a child who had learned to give healers only what they asked for, because more than that seemed to make them complicated. "Third recurrence this winter," Sorcha said to Pella. Pella nodded. What did the first healer say exactly? His full recommendation: rest, honey root tea, keep him from the cold. Sorcha said nothing for a moment. She was looking at Fenn's fingernails, which had the faint blue tinge she had been expecting. He should not have been given honey root. It opens the chest passages in the short term, but it doesn't address the underlying mucus accumulation, and in recurrent cases, it can create a dependency cycle where the tissue rebounds between doses. He likely improved, then worsened worse than before. Pella said nothing. Her face said it had happened exactly that way. What I'm going to use is a combination of 3 things: steam with eucalyptus oil twice a day, morning and before sleep, a compound of thyme, hyssop, and dried horehound, brewed strong and given in small doses 4 times through the day. And a chest wrap, not for heat, for the pressure. It helps the muscles work less hard while the inflammation settles. I'll need the oil, the herbs, most of which you likely have in the kitchen, and cloth, linen if you have it, wool if you don't. Pella's arms uncrossed by the span of perhaps 2 inches. How long? Before he breathes easier. 2 to 3 days. Before I'd call him improved. A week. Before I'd consider the episode resolved. 2 weeks minimum. And then I want to see him on a preventive compound through the rest of winter. 1 dose a day. Small. Just enough to keep the passages clear. The other healer said a week. And he was done. The other healer was wrong, Sorcha said. I am sorry he was wrong. I am going to try to fix what that cost you. Pella's arms uncrossed the rest of the way. She went to find the cloth. While she was gone, Fenn studied Sorcha with that flat, ancient child logic that did not evaluate credentials, only behavior. Are you new here? He said. Yes. Is Pell your steward? He seems to be. He is nice, Fenn said. He gave me his bread twice when I was too sick to eat mine, and felt bad that it was wasted. Sorcha looked at the boy. She thought about Pell, thin in the way of someone who ate irregularly. That was kind of him, she said. She meant it. She was still thinking about it when Pella came back with the cloth. She spent the next hour with Fenn, establishing the first steam treatment and the first dose of the compound. She showed Pella exactly what to measure, exactly what to watch for, and she wrote it out in clear, plain letters on a piece of paper torn from the back of her folding ledger, because she knew that written instructions were kept, and verbal ones were misremembered by the 3rd day of illness, when sleep deprivation started eating at the details. She was wrapping Fenn's chest with the linen when the kitchen door opened and Pell came in, carrying a covered pot and looking mildly panicked. He stopped when he saw Sorcha. Alpha is asking about you, Pell said. She tied off the wrap. Tell him I'm with a patient. Pell's expression suggested that this was not information he was prepared to deliver without some personal discomfort. He sent Yarrow to find you. Yarrow is not someone who returns empty-handed. He can wait 3 minutes, Sorcha said. This is the last step, and I'm not stopping it. Pell opened his mouth, closed it, turned and went out, presumably to tell Yarrow something, presumably not the accurate version. Fen watched this with his large, flat, watchful eyes. "You're not scared of the Alpha," he said. "I have other things to think about right now," Sorcha said. She finished the wrap. She stood. She put her tools back in order in the satchel, and she told Pella everything one more time to make sure, and she said she would return in the morning. Then she followed Pell's direction upward, through the hall, toward whatever Darius Kale wanted from her. He was waiting in a room she had not seen before, on the second floor above the great hall, a smaller chamber, with a fire, and a table, and 2 chairs, and a shelf of ledgers along the wall, that she noticed immediately, because she noticed all shelves of ledgers immediately. Yarrow was outside the door, a large man, patient the way large men who are good at their work tend to be patient, with no particular malice that she could find in his posture. He had opened the door for her and positioned himself outside it, which told her this was a conversation and not an arrest. Darius was standing at the shelf. He was not reading. He was looking at the spines. He turned when she entered. She realized, the first time she had been physically close enough to assess him properly. He was taller than he'd appeared seated, broad through the chest and shoulders, in the proportioned way of men who had done physical work for a long time, and whose bodies had grown into the shape of it, rather than been built for show. He had a scar on the underside of his jaw, a clean old one, and 3 days of growth along it. His hands at his sides were large and still. "You were with the cook's child," he said. "Yes. How is the boy?" "Improving. He'll need 2 weeks of consistent treatment." He had an inadequate first course and 2 relapses that have left the tissue more reactive than it should be at his age. Darius was quiet for a moment. "The healer Hadrick authorized, the traveling one. I wasn't aware it was Hadrick's authorization to give. That landed exactly as she had intended it to. Clean, flat, unapologetic." His jaw moved slightly. "He oversees hall health allocations under the Eastern Charter. Then the Eastern Charter has a gap in it, because the allocation he made failed a 7-year-old child and cost his mother 40 silver for the privilege." The room was quiet. Outside the window, wind moved across the hall roof and dropped away. Darius turned to the shelf. He pulled out one of the ledgers, and this time she could see it was right side up. He set it on the table and opened it to a marked page, and she looked and understood immediately. It was the hall's medical allocation record. The entry for Fen was there, 11 lines in a cramped, formal hand, recording the single consult, the 40 silver payment, and the recommended treatment. The next entry was blank. "There should be a second entry," Sorcha said. "There should be a second entry," Darius agreed. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "And a third. Instead, the page ends there." She studied the ledger. She studied the other entries around it. Her 7 pages of notes on the council's judgment record had given her the shapes. The ledger was giving her the specifics. She pointed to a line, 3 entries above Fen's. "This treatment authorization. Who did this one benefit?" He looked at the line. His expression did not change, but something in his stillness changed quality. "That is Hadrick's son," he said. "He was injured in a training incident last spring. He received 4 consults, 3 courses of treatment, and a recovery period allocation. Total, 11 days of hall healer resource, 320 silver." She said the number and let it sit. She looked at the blank space below Fen's entry. 40 silver, she said. 1 consult, honey root tea. The fire crackled. The wind moved outside. Darius closed the ledger. "You've seen other records." It was not a question, because he had returned her satchel. "I've seen the public judgment record," she said. 7 months of it. There are patterns in who receives what kind of allocation from this hall. They align with rank and with proximity to certain council members. They do not align with need. He looked at her for a moment. "And you came to this council hall as tribute from a hill settlement?" "Yes." Because a water rights dispute was judged against your village. Yes. And what was your interest in that judgment? She looked at him. The river that supplies Kale's Crossing runs through Greyvale territory for 9 miles before it reaches us. Your territory. For 3 years running, the upper diversions reduced our dry season flow by 40%. That's not a water rights dispute. That's a slow elimination of a settlement's growing capacity. I filed 7 written objections with this council's administrative office. All 7 were recorded, and none were replied to. Silence. Not the short silence of a conversation pausing. The longer kind, where a room seems to be taking in information and processing it. You filed 7 objections, Darius said. Yes, I was not shown 7 objections. He said it the way you say something that is not a surprise and is also not acceptable. No, Sorcha said. You weren't. She watched that land. She watched his face stay still and his eyes not move from hers, and something happened behind them that was not readable yet. She had planted the question that mattered. She had let him draw the conclusion it demanded. She had not needed to say Hadrick's name a second time. She stood and left, because there was nothing else required of her in that room tonight, and because the exit was its own kind of statement. She was moving under her own authority. Still, especially now. Hadrick moved against her on the 5th day. She had known he would. She had not known it would be so visible, which told her that Hadrick was, under the administrator's patience, a man who acted from emotion when he felt his ground shift beneath him. He came to the annex himself, which was the first mistake, because coming himself meant he could not later claim the act was procedural. He brought 2 junior council clerks, which was the second mistake, because witnesses cut both ways. He arrived at 7th hour while she was compounding the thyme hyssop preparation for Fen, and while Barrow, who had come in that morning for the first time to ask about his joint compound, was sitting on the end of one of the cot frames watching her work, and not particularly pretending he was there for any reason other than to observe. Hadrick looked at Barrow. Barrow looked back with the patience of a man whose face had a scar that pulled when he frowned, and who had found it more economical to simply not arrange his features. Hadrick looked at Sorcha. The Alpha has requested a review of your service assignment, he said. Specifically, the Eastern Charter does not provide for an Omega healer to operate independently from council oversight. Your current activities exceed the terms of your tribute placement. She was using a small brass scale with weights she had cleaned and recalibrated on her second morning, because 3 of the hall's original weights had been imprecise by 6 to 12 grains, and imprecision in compound measurement was how you created new problems while attempting to treat existing ones. I'm aware of the Eastern Charter, she said. I have a copy. Hadrick's 2 clerks looked at each other. Hadrick said, The Charter does not extend independent healing authority to Omegas, Sorcha said. Correct. It does not. It does extend provisional authority to any healer in active service to the Hall during a period when the Hall has no certified healer in residence, under Section 14, Clause 3, which has been in effect since the previous healer left, 8 months ago. She set down the measuring weight. She turned. I can show you the section if you'd like. I made a note of the page number when I read it. It's page 41. Barrow made a sound that could have been a cough. Hadrick's face was the color of old ash. Section 14 is an emergency provision. It is not intended to. The cook's child nearly had a 3rd relapse on the same inadequate treatment protocol your authorized healer prescribed, Sorcha said. I am choosing to interpret that as an emergency. The room was quiet. Hadrick's 2 clerks were looking at the floor. Barrow was looking at the ceiling with the studied disinterest of a man absolutely determined to remember everything he had just heard. This conversation, Hadrick said, is not finished. No, Sorcha agreed. It isn't. He left. His 2 clerks followed. The door to the covered walkway banged open against the wind and banged shut again. Sorcha turned back to her measuring. Barrow waited until the footsteps had faded into the corridor, then said, "The joint compound is working, by the way. The stiffness in the morning is down by about half." "Good," she said. "Alternate the preparations as I wrote. Don't skip the off days. The tissue needs the rest from the compound as much as it needs the compound." "Where did you learn all this?" he said. Not skepticism, genuine curiosity, turned over in his hands like something he had picked up and wasn't sure what it was. "My mother, her teacher before her. 7 years of practice in hill settlements where if you don't know it, you work it out, or someone suffers for it." Barrow sat with that for a moment. "Hadrick will take this to the Alpha." "I expect so," she said. "Are you worried?" Sorcha considered. "Not about the charter argument," she said. That was the honest answer, and she left it there. What she was thinking about was the 7 objections that had not reached Darius's desk. What she was thinking about was how a council operated in the gap between a powerful man's attention and the limits of what he could see. What she was thinking about was Fenn's breathing, easier now, and the fact that easy breathing was proof that existed in the world, and that proof was a language no charter clause could revise. Fenn was breathing clearly by the 8th day. Pella brought Sorcha a plate of food she had not asked for and did not refuse. Marit appeared in the annex every second morning and reorganized whatever Sorcha had reorganized the day before, but the reorganizations were always improvements rather than contradictions, and by the 3rd week they had developed a working method between them that had no name and required no discussion. Barrow's joints improved on schedule. He started arriving at the annex in the morning not for treatment, but with information, delivered in the offhand style of a man who happened to be mentioning things that happened to be relevant. 2 other council members, not Via, not Hadrick, had been asking Barrow questions about the Eastern Charter Section 14. One of them had apparently gone to look up page 41. One of the hall's ranked warriors, a woman named Sev, who had been managing a tendon injury with gritted teeth for 6 weeks, rather than ask Hadrick's allocation process for help, found her way to the annex on the 9th day and stood in the doorway and said nothing for about 30 seconds before Sorcha said, "Sit down and show me." The injury was manageable. The delay had made it take longer. Sorcha said both of those things plainly, and Sev received both of them without argument, because Sev was the kind of person who accepted information at the same rate they gave it, directly and without drama. By the 12th day, there were mornings when the annex had 4 people in it. Not all of them were there for treatment. Some of them were there, in the way that people are drawn to a place that is running well, when most things around them are not. The way you find yourself walking toward a fire in a cold field, not because you plan to, but because warmth makes its own gravity. Pell came one morning, and Sorcha noticed, because she kept noticing, that he ate the full breakfast from the tray he brought, rather than leaving part of it, and she said nothing about it. The one thing in the hall that did not improve was Hadrick's position. She could feel it deteriorating, the way you feel a rope taking weight. Each day the tension was more evident, and the rope was not getting stronger. On the 14th day, Hadrick called a special council session. Marit told her about it, at 6th hour, with the same tone she used for everything, which was the tone of a woman reporting the temperature. Sorcha thanked her. She went to the annex. She made up the day's compound preparations. She treated Sev's tendon. She answered 2 questions about a food-related complaint in the hall's upper barracks that had been mistaken for a fever, but was almost certainly a bile imbalance. She did all of this, and she waited. At 2 hours past midday, Pell came to the annex door. He looked like he had been walking fast and had not entirely caught his breath. "The council has summoned you," he said. "All right," Sorcha said. She cleaned her hands. She dried them on the cloth she kept for that purpose. She put on her coat. She walked with Pell through the hall, back toward the great room, and the quality of the air in the corridor changed before she arrived, the way it changes before a storm. The great room was full, every council member present, a group of ranked warriors from the hall who had apparently been asked to attend, or had asked to attend themselves, which was two different things. Merit, in her corner with her ledger, Barrow with his frown pulling his scar, Vaya with her hands folded and her eyes already on the door when Sorcha walked through it, and Darius at the head of the table, still and heavy in his chair, like something poured into the shape of it and allowed to set. Hadrick stood to the left of the table. He was holding a formal document. He was holding it the way people hold objects when they want the object to confer authority that the moment itself might not supply. He began speaking before Sorcha had fully reached the center of the room. He was precise, and he was formal, and his language was charter language, the kind of language that has been refined over generations to do one thing, which is to make an outcome appear inevitable. He outlined Section 14, and he outlined its emergency clause, and he argued that the conditions for the clause had not been met, because the hall had not been formally designated as operating without a certified healer, the previous healer having left without a formal vacancy declaration, and therefore Sorcha's independent practice was not protected, and her 14 days of activity constituted an ongoing breach. He finished. He set the document on the table. The room was quiet. Sorcha thought about a 7-year-old boy breathing clearly. She thought about Sev's tendon at 60% function instead of 30. She thought about 7 objections that went unrecorded on a powerful man's desk. She thought about the difference between the thing a room believes is happening and the thing that actually is. She stood in the center of the great room, and she looked at Hadrick, and then she looked at the council, and then she looked at Darius, and she said, "He is right about the vacancy declaration." Hadrick blinked. He had not expected concession, neither had anyone else. "The declaration was not made," Sorcha continued, "because the process for making it requires the outgoing healer to file a departure notice, which the previous healer would have known and would have done, unless there was a reason the departure did not proceed through normal channels. I spoke with Lyra 2 nights ago, the former healer. She is living in the settlement 12 miles east of this hall. She left 8 months ago without filing a departure notice, not because she forgot, but because she was told the position had been discontinued and that no filing was necessary. The room was quiet in a different way now. "She has the letter," Sorcha said. "She kept it. It is signed by a council administrative officer." She paused. "The letter does not carry the Alpha's seal." Barrow's chair moved. Not loudly, just enough. Vaya turned her head toward Hadrick, with the slow, deliberate motion of a woman who has been patient about something for a very long time. Hadrick said, "The administrative officer would have had. Read the letter, Hadrick." It was Darius. 3 words. They came out of the lower register, and they landed in the center of the room, and Hadrick stopped, mid-clause, the way a clock stops when someone removes the weight. The silence after that lasted perhaps 8 seconds. Sorcha counted them. She did not fill them. The crowd in the room, the warriors, the staff, the council members who were not Hadrick, had become very still, not afraid, something different. They were watching the way people watch when something that has been wrong for a long time is being named in a room too large to pretend it wasn't heard. Darius turned from Hadrick and looked at Sorcha. "The 7 objections," he said. She said, "Yes." "Filed by Kale's Crossing, regarding the upper diversion, through the council administrative office, over a period of 3 years. Yes. Were you the one who filed them?" "6 of them," she said. "The 7th was filed by my village elder, 2 days before he died. He asked me to follow up." Silence. "None of them reached my desk," Darius said. "The room heard it. Every person in it. She let them hear it. She did not say what it meant. She did not need to." The room was already drawing the line from 7 objections to the administrative officer who signed the letter that was not sealed, and to the vacancy declaration that was never filed, and to the 40 silver consult that had failed a 7-year-old child, and to the 320 silver treatment that had been given to Hadrick's son. She had not drawn that line out loud. She had laid the points and let the room draw it. That was how it was done when you wanted something to hold. Hadrick was not removed that day. He was suspended from council function pending review, which in language of the hall was a significant and public thing, even when it was stated with administrative calm. The 2 clerks who had accompanied him to the annex on the 5th day were also suspended pending review. The administrative officer, who had signed the letter without seal, resigned by the following morning, before anyone came to ask him questions, which meant he knew the answer to the question everyone was going to ask. Darius ordered a full audit of the Eastern Charter's allocation records going back 4 years. He ordered it publicly in the Great Room, and he named Maret as the audit overseer, which meant the audit would be thorough and would not misplace anything. Sorcha returned to the annex. She had 3 patients that afternoon, and she treated them. Vaya came in at the end of the afternoon and sat on one of the cot frames and looked at the organized shelves for a moment. "How old were you when you filed the first objection?" Vaya said. 23. "And you kept filing. What else was there to do?" Vaya was quiet for a moment. "Lyra," she said, "you said you spoke to her 2 nights ago." "Yes. How long had you known where she was?" Sorcha considered the question. "Since the 3rd day," she said. "I found out through Maret, who knew, because Maret knows where everyone is." Vaya said, "You waited 11 days. I needed to know what I was dealing with before I used it. Information used wrong is worse than no information." Vaya looked at her, not the way Hadrick had looked at her, not with the flat commercial assessment of a problem or a commodity, with the look of someone revising an estimate that had already been revised twice. "The Alpha wants to see you," Vaya said. "When you're finished here." "I'll be finished in an hour." Vaya stood. At the door she stopped. "The vacancy declaration for the hall healer position," she said. "I will make sure it is filed correctly," followed by a new appointment process, conducted through the proper channels, with the Alpha's seal on every document. She left. The herbs sat in their correct jars on their correct shelves, in the order she had established, and the compound preparations were labeled and dated, and the bone-handled tools were clean, and the balance weights had been recalibrated, and the whole room was running the way it was supposed to run. She thought about Kale's crossing. She thought about the river, and the dry season flow, and her village elder filing his last objection 2 days before he died. She thought about 11 days of patience, and what 11 days of patience had made possible. She thought about the fact that she had not been rescued. She had been placed in a hall that needed what she knew, and she had done what she knew, and the rest had followed from that. She put on her coat. She went to find Darius. He was in the room with the ledger shelf again. This time he was standing at the window, and the fire was lower, and the room had the quality of a room where someone had been sitting quietly for a long time and had recently stood up. He turned when she came in, and Yarrow pulled the door from the outside, and she heard it close behind her. The fire crackled, wind outside, the same window, north-facing, and the dark coming early the way it did in this part of the territory. He said, "Sit down if you like. I'm fine standing." He turned fully toward her, and something in the quality of his stillness had changed. He was still substantial, still dense in the way of the iron chair at the council table, but there was a quality of attention in him now that had been organized differently. He was not waiting for her to diminish. He had already revised what diminishment had been expected. "You came here as tribute," he said. "From a village your council had taken water from for 3 years, while 7 objections went unanswered. Yes, you were placed in an antechamber for 40 minutes while we decided what to do with you. Yes, and you spent that time counting torches and converting the charges against you into penalty weights." She looked at him. He had not been in the antechamber. She had not told anyone what she had done with those 40 minutes. Pell had not been present. She filed that. "I assumed," Darius said quietly, "from the way you walked in." She said nothing. "What do you want?" he said. "From this hall. From this situation. Not what you'll accept, what you want." No one had asked her that before. Not in this context, not with this weight behind it. She thought about the precise wording. She had planned for many versions of this conversation, and none of them had started with this question. "I want the water rights revised," she said. "Formally, with seal, on terms that reflect the actual flow impact of the upper diversions, and that are calculated based on the agricultural records of the affected settlements, not on the Greyvale administrative estimate, which is wrong by approximately 30%. And I want the 7 objections acknowledged, not apologized for, acknowledged in the public record as having been filed and not received, and as requiring remedy. And," she looked at him steadily, "I want to keep working in this annex, under proper appointment, with the authority that appointment carries, because there are people in this hall who need what I know how to do, and I am not going to stop doing it because the process hadn't been formalized." He was quiet for a moment. "Those are terms," he said. "Yes," she said. "They are." The fire settled. He looked at her with his November Lake eyes, and she looked back, and the room held the weight of the exchange, without either of them adding to it. "The water rights will be revised," he said. "The records will be corrected. The appointment will be made through the proper process." He paused. "The 40 silver that was paid for the inadequate consult will be returned to Pella, with an additional 20 for the cost of the relapses." She had not asked for that. She absorbed it, without showing what it cost to absorb. "Good," she said. It was a short word, and she meant all of it. He said, "You should know that the document I was reading during the opening session was a summary of your village's administrative history with this hall's council. Someone forwarded it to me that morning." "Before I arrived? 2 hours before you arrived?" She thought about that. Who forwarded it? He looked at her for a moment. "Merit," he said. She almost laughed. She compressed it to the smallest possible thing, a breath, a slight movement at the corner of her mouth. Merit, who kept the hall accounts, who knew where Lyra was living, and had told Sorcha on the 3rd day because Sorcha had asked the right question, who had reorganized Sorcha's shelf arrangements into improvements and stood aside in a doorway and said "all right" in the voice of a door deciding to open. Merit, who had apparently been waiting for someone to bring the right information to the right room. "The document was upside down," Sorcha said. Darius said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'd already read it." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something shifted in the room's temperature. That was not the fire. It was small. It was a beginning, the way a crack in stone in the first day of spring thaw is a beginning, not dramatic, just the first sign of a structure deciding which way it is going to go. She was still standing. She had made no move toward the chair. She had made no move toward the door. She was in this room under her own authority, on her own terms, for the second time, and this time the terms were already agreed, and the ground beneath them was different. "I'll need access to the administrative charter files for the water rights revision," she said. "I know what the calculation should look like. I want to verify the numbers myself. I'll have Merit arrange it." "Tell her I'll bring the grain tea," Sorcha said. "She'll need it by the 3rd ledger." He almost said something. She could see it. A muscle in his jaw shifted and settled. It was not quite a smile. The way her almost laugh had not quite been a laugh, but it was the same temperature. She turned and opened the door and walked out into the corridor, and behind her, the room she had left was not the same room as the one she had entered. Neither was she. She visited Fen the next morning, and he was, as she had expected, sitting up in his bed with color in his face, and the flat, watchful eyes now carrying something that was not quite delight, but was adjacent to it. He was eating porridge. He was eating it with the focused seriousness of a child who had been told by his body that food was important and had decided to take the instruction literally. "Better," Sorcha said. "Much," he said, through the porridge. "The tight thing is gone. It will come back if we stop the compound too early. We won't stop it too early. Are you staying?" he said. He asked it the way children ask things that adults circle for 20 minutes, directly, with no decorative approach. "Yes," she said. That was the first time she had said it out loud. She thought about the water rights and the seal that would be on the new document, and the village elder who had filed a last objection 2 days before he died. She thought about Kale's crossing and the river, and the way the dry season flow had been reduced for 3 years, and how it would be corrected, and how it would be recorded in the public ledger, and how that ledger would be permanent, in a way that the original wrong had been permanent. You did not erase what had happened. You added to the record the correction, and the correction was also permanent, and the correction was also public, and that was what accountability looked like in a system made of stone and charter and ink. Fen finished his porridge. He put the bowl down with the satisfied certainty of a task completed, and looked at her. "Pell says you made the Alpha think harder," he said. Sorcha picked up her satchel. "Pell talks too much," she said. She said it warmly. She left Fen to his morning, walked back through the kitchen corridor, up through the covered walkway that threw wind at her, on 3 sides as usual, and into the annex. Merritt was already there, standing at the compound shelf with a cup of tea she had apparently brought herself, studying the labels on the jars. "Grain tea," Merritt said, without looking up. "Third ledger. I heard you said that." Sorcha sat down at the work table and opened the folding ledger. "How long have you been waiting for someone to bring the right documents to the right desk?" she said. Merritt drank her tea. 4 years, she said, approximately. "You could have gone directly to the Alpha." "Yes," Merritt said. "I could have. And I would have been one person making an accusation. You are evidence." She set down her cup, considerably more useful. The annex smelled of eucalyptus, of thyme, of linseed oil, and the thin, sharp mineral undertone of the copper compound, and beneath all of it, the clean, faint smell of a room that was being used for what it was built for. Outside, the wind moved across the hall roof, and somewhere in the eastern corridor, a door was pulled shut by someone in a hurry. The day arranged itself around the work, the way days do when the work is real and the ground under it is solid. Sev came in at 9th hour for her tendon treatment. 2 new patients arrived before midday. Barrow appeared with a question about the compound alternation schedule and stayed longer than the question required, which she had come to recognize as his version of checking in. She answered the question, and the sub-question, and the question beneath that, which was whether things were going to hold. She said they were. She thought they were. She had dictated the terms, and the terms had been accepted, and she was in this place now, under her own authority, by her own choosing, in the room she had made work, with the patients who needed what she knew, and above all of that, 7 objections had been filed, and 7 objections would now be answered, and a river that had been running thin for 3 years was going to run full again. She had not been rescued. She had not been chosen. She had been placed in a hostile hall as property and settlement of a water rights dispute, and she had done what she knew how to do, and the doing had changed the shape of the hall around her. Darius Kale had thought she was tribute. He had let his counsel judge her on the first night and called it a proceeding. What he had not known, what none of them had known, was that she had already been judging him. She had been judging the council for 7 months through their own records. She had been judging the hall for 8 months through the vacancy that should not have been a vacancy. She had been judging the process that had buried 7 objections, and she had come prepared, and she had been patient, and she had been precise, and those 3 things together were, in her experience, the only tools that actually worked. Everything else, the status, the charter, the formal procedure, the document held at a certain angle, was theater. She had never been much for theater. The afternoon light came through the north window of the annex, at an angle, and caught the labeled jars on the shelf, and made them look, for a moment, like something worth naming. She did not name them. She recorded the day's treatment notes in her folding ledger. She wrote in her small, clear hand. She dated each entry. She closed the ledger and put it in the satchel, and she stood at the window for a moment, looking north at the Greyvale territory under its winter sky, the long, flat fields going grey at the edges, and the tree line dark beyond them, and somewhere 12 miles east, a former healer in a settlement who would be contacted by the hall's proper channels before the week was out. The ground had changed. She had changed it, specifically by knowing things and using them at the right moment, which was not luck, and was not magic, and was not the sudden charity of a powerful man's attention. It was work, the same kind she had always done. She turned from the window and went back to the table. He came to the annex on the 16th day. She was alone, mid-morning, working through the supply inventory because 3 new patients meant faster consumption rates, and she wanted to project the next month's needs accurately before requesting a resupply allocation from Merritt's accounts. She heard his step in the covered walkway, heavier than Barrow's, more deliberate than Pell's, and she knew who it was before the door opened. He came in and looked at the room. He had not been in it before. He took it in the way he had stood at the ledger shelf, without editorial, cataloguing. He looked at the labeled jars and the organized cot frames, and the bone-handled tools laid out in their leather wrap beside the work table, and the folding ledger open to the inventory page. He looked at the fire, which was the right size for the room and the work. He looked at her. "I wanted to see it," he said. "Working. You could have sent Pell." "Yes," he said. He moved to the shelf and looked at the labels without touching anything. "The audit is 2 weeks from completion," he said. "Merritt says 3. It will be 3. He turned. "The water rights document is drafted." Vaya reviewed it. "The numbers are as you specified. I want to see it before the seal goes on." "I know," he said. "Merritt told me. She also told me the grain tea was your idea. It was hers. I gave her credit for the method." He looked at her with the November lake eyes. The morning light from the north window was behind her, and she stood at the work table with her inventory list and her measuring scale and the room around her that she had made into what it was, and he stood in it as someone who had walked into a thing already in progress and was still working out how to account for himself in it. "You said you wanted to keep working here," he said. "On your own terms." "Yes. I want to understand what that looks like over time, not what the charter says, what you want it to look like." It was the same question he had asked before, the directness of it, the willingness to ask what she wanted, rather than what she would accept. She set down her pen. She told him what a proper healer's annex needed, in terms of supply access, patient dignity, freedom from allocation politics, and a clear line of authority that ran to the alpha, and not through council members who had financial interests in the outcome of health decisions. She told him what the preventive compound program for Fen would look like, extended to other children in the hall's dependent households, and what that would cost, and why it would cost less than repeated crisis interventions. She told him she would need an assistant by spring if the patient load continued at its current rate, and that she had a candidate in mind, a girl from Kale's Crossing who had been training under her for 2 years and who would travel for the appointment if it were offered properly. She talked for 12 minutes. He listened without interrupting once. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. It was what Merritt had said on the first morning, the same words, the same simplicity, the sound of a decision made rather than deferred. She thought about the antechamber, 40 minutes, cold stone underfoot, torches burning in 9 count along the far corridor. She thought about the chair at the head of the long table and the man who had been reading an upside-down document and had known she was coming for 2 hours before she arrived. She thought about 7 objections and one that had been filed by a dying man who had trusted she would follow up. She had followed up. She picked up her pen. "The water rights document," she said. "Have it sent to the annex. I'll review it before the end of the day." He said, "I'll bring it myself." She looked up at him. He was standing in the room she had built, with his hands at his sides, and his November eyes steady, and the scar on his jaw catching the north light, and the quality of his stillness was different from the council chamber's stillness. It was not the stillness of something decided. It was the stillness of something waiting to begin. "All right," she said. She went back to her inventory. He stayed a moment longer, then turned, and she heard his step in the covered walkway, deliberate and heavy and unhurried, going back through the hall. She did not watch him go. She wrote down the numbers. She would check them twice, because she checked everything twice. The fire burned at the right size for the room. The herbs sat in their labeled jars. The day continued its work. The ground under it was solid, and the river at Kale's Crossing would run full again in spring, and a 7-year-old boy with watchful eyes was eating his porridge in the kitchen quarters, and the record would show all of it, sealed, public, and permanent, which was the only kind of truth that lasted in a world made of stone and charter and the long, cold patience of people who knew how to wait for the right moment and then, without announcement, without theater, move. He brought the water rights document himself, as he had said. He came at the end of the day, when the light from the north window had gone flat and grey, and Sorcha had lit the 2 lamps on the work table, and the annex had taken on the specific intimacy of a working room at the close of a working day. He set the document on the table without ceremony. She read it carefully, every clause, every number, referencing the calculation notes she had made in the margin of her folding ledger and comparing them against the drafted text. He sat on the end of one of the cot frames and waited, which was something she had not expected from him. She had expected him to leave the document and go. He did not go. He sat with the patience of a man who had recalibrated himself in the direction of someone else's timeline, and she read, and when she found one number that was off by 3%, he said nothing when she marked it, and when she looked up to ask about the clause regarding seasonal adjustment, he answered without consulting any notes, because he had read the document himself and knew it. They revised 2 clauses. It took 40 minutes. The fire had burned down to a working coal orange by the time she set down her pen and looked at the document and found it correct. "I'll send it to Vaya tonight," he said. "She'll have it sealed by morning." "Good," she said. The room was quiet and warm and smelled of the day's work, eucalyptus and thyme and the faint metallic trace of the compound preparation, and they were both at the work table, in the 2 available chairs, and the space between them was the particular quality of space that has been reduced incrementally and honestly rather than all at once. "The girl from Kale's Crossing," he said. "Your candidate for the assistant position. Yes, she's been training under you for 2 years, since she was 17. She has good hands, and she listens better than she talks, which is the correct ratio for this work." "What's her name?" "Kala," Sorcha said. "Her mother is a midwife. She grew up knowing what blood and necessity look like." He nodded slowly. "Send for her," he said. "I'll authorize the travel and the apprentice stipend. Full record, proper seal." Sorcha looked at him. He was looking at the document on the table, the completed one, the one with the corrected numbers, and the 2 revised clauses, and the 30% adjustment to the flow calculation that was closer to the truth than anything the Grey Veil administrative estimate had ever produced. He looked like a man who was finding, in the process of correcting a thing, that the correcting itself had weight, and that the weight was not unpleasant. You didn't know about any of it, she said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of the thing, as she had come to understand it, said plainly in the spirit of the record being accurate. Not specifically, he said. I knew there were gaps between what the council handled and what reached me. I had chosen to interpret those gaps as efficiency rather than excision. He said it with the flatness of a man making an honest assessment of himself. That's done now. Yes, she said. It is. The fire settled with a sound like a period at the end of a long sentence. He looked at her. She looked back, and in the space between them, the thing that had been growing its way toward the surface over 16 days of cold stone and torchlight, and 7 objections finally answered, arrived quietly, without theater, the way the best things arrive, already present before either person named it. I'd like to begin again, he said. He said it the way he said most things, low, without decoration, a statement rather than a request, but the asking was in it. She could hear the asking in it. She thought about the antechamber and the cold floor and counting torches, because there was nothing else to count, and the private promise she had made to move under her own authority all the way to the end, wherever the end arrived. She thought about the fact that she was still here by choice, not by tribute, not by settlement of debt, by choice, on her own terms, in the room she had made work. All right, she said, the same 2 words, the same door deciding to open. He did not reach for her hand across the table. She did not move toward him. They were both people who moved deliberately and had learned the cost of moving before the ground was ready. But the document between them on the table was correct now, sealed in the morning, and the river at Kale's Crossing would run full again in spring, and in the kitchen quarters a boy with watchful eyes was sleeping easily for the first time in 3 months, and in the covered walkway the wind that found no way into well-built rooms moved across the eastern wall of the hall and could not enter. The ground was solid. It had taken 16 days of patience and 7 months of preparation before that, and a dying man's last act of faith in a process he would not live to see completed. It was solid. That was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything, really, in the way that ordinary things, done with full care, are everything. The labeled jar on the correct shelf, the number written twice and verified, the document with the corrected figures, and the proper seal, the boys breathing easy in the dark, the river on its way to full, and the room warm and lit and running exactly as it was meant to run. She had come here with nothing but what she knew how to do. What she knew how to do had turned out to be the one thing this place needed most. He had thought she was tribute. He had let his counsel judge her, and had let the proceedings stand, and had sat at the head of a long table, reading an upside-down document, and she had walked the length of that room under her own authority, and had not looked away once. What he had not known was that she had been judging him from the first moment, the same way she judged every situation she walked into, precisely, patiently, and with the complete intention of fixing what was broken. She had fixed it, and she had, in the end, decided to stay. That is what a person does when they understand the difference between the place they were sent and the place they chose. She had been sent here. She was staying by choice. The difference between those 2 things was the whole story. That is what Sorcha proved in this hall, that knowledge is power, yes, but patience is the thing that decides when and where that power lands. If that kind of story hits you somewhere true, do us a favor and leave a like. It takes half a second, and it tells us you want more stories built this way. Share this one with someone who understands why the woman who gets underestimated is always the most dangerous person in the room. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next, because these stories always have a next. And we want to ask you something in the comments. When Sorcha gave back those 2 words, all right, the same words Maret had used, the same words Darius used, do you think that was deliberate on her part, Or do you think she had simply become the kind of person who makes decisions the same way she mixes a compound, precisely and without waste? Tell us down there. We'll be watching. The river runs full. We will see you in the next one.